Hello and welcome to our live stream on YouTube and TikTok. This is DW News and I'm Gerhard Alfers in Berlin. 21 hours. That's how long the world has held its breath while US and Iranian officials sat across from each other in Islamabad waiting for the other side to blink first. But as of this Sunday morning, the verdict is in, and it's not the one everyone was hoping for. The talks have collapsed. No deal, no signatures, just a whole lot of finger-pointing. Vice President JD Vance didn't mince his words before wheels up. He basically told reporters, "We laid out our red lines specifically on nuclear weapons, and Iran walked away." He even added a bit of a sting, saying this failure hurts Tehran a lot more than it hurts Washington. Meanwhile, in Iran, state media is hitting back, calling American demands excessive and describing an atmosphere of pure mistrust. The stakes couldn't be higher. We're talking about a 6-week war that's already killed thousands and sent your gas prices soaring. While a few tankers finally did squeeze through the Strait of Hormuz yesterday, hundreds more are still sitting there idle. The US says it is prepping a mine-clearing operation now, apparently trying to unblock the strait by force. So, where do we go from here? Does the ceasefire hold? Are we headed back to airstrikes? We're breaking down the mood swings in the negotiation room, the nuclear sticking points, and what Vance and the rest of the delegation did bring back from that table. And if you have any questions for our experts, do post them here in the comments, both on TikTok and on YouTube. I'll try and pass them on to our experts. And let's bring in the first of them. Our first guest, Scott Lucas, is Professor of American Studies at the UCD Clinton Institute and also editor of EA Worldview. That's an analysis website focusing on the Middle East. Scott, welcome to our live stream. Very briefly, which side do you think needs an agreement more urgently right now?
Well, both sides need an agreement, but both sides are not going to make concessions to get the agreement. The Iranian regime needs an agreement for survival. They have taken a lot of damage from the U.S. and from Israel. That's damage to infrastructure. That's damage to their military, but it's also the killing of their leaders, the supreme leader, dozens of officials and commanders. But they have survived so far. On the American side, I think it's interesting because, you know, the primary American demands, at least in terms of rhetoric, still are that Iran get rid of its nuclear program, get rid of its ballistic missile program. But I think now the priority for the Trump camp is to try to ease Iran's grip on the Strait of Hormuz, which has had such an effect on energy, on fertilizer, and on other commodities. And that gives the Iranians leverage. What we saw yesterday was that the Iranians were clearly not going to make a move to ease up on the Strait of Hormuz, not even as a confidence-building measure, without something in return from the Americans. There was a flutter at one point that the Americans might offer to unfreeze Iranian assets as a goodwill measure. That never materialized. There was never anything else that came out that appeared to be a compromise on the military or political issues. And so I wasn't holding my breath yesterday, just to add to your introduction, because I always thought this would be talks about talks rather than anything substantial coming out. I'm holding my breath now because the question is, do we get those further talks or do we return to that choice that the U.S. administration has? Which apparently is either continue the discussion.
Yeah, apparently the Pakistani, as you just said, will we have another round of talks? Apparently the Pakistanis have said there will be another round of talks, but I doubt that there has been any confirmation from the US or Iranian side. But before we continue, just let's listen in to JD Vance, the US Vice President, leader of the US delegation in these negotiations, what he had to say after these negotiations finished.
We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms. I won't go into all the details because I don't want to negotiate in public after we negotiated for 21 hours in private. But the simple fact is that we need to see an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon, and they will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve a nuclear weapon. That is the core goal of the President of the United States, and that's what we've tried to achieve through these negotiations.
Now, let's focus on that nuclear affirmative commitment. That means Iran basically promising to never develop a nuclear bomb. Why has the US shifted the goalposts back to the nuclear issue when the immediate crisis is a regional hot war and a global energy blockade?
Well, I mean, let's say something factually, first of all, and that is that, just to repeat, Iran does not have a nuclear weapon. Iran is enriching uranium to 60%. It has the potential to enrich it further for a nuclear weapon. But in their 10-point proposal, which Donald Trump accepted as the basis for these discussions last Tuesday, they made the commitment not to pursue a nuclear weapon. Now, you can say we don't trust them, but that then brings you into the question of what steps do you arrange around Iran's uranium enrichment? And I think the key point we need to make is that we had that agreement in 2015, where Iran was only enriching uranium to 3.67%. So the Trump folks are trying to get us back to an agreement that they ripped up. Now, in terms of why they're emphasizing it, Gerhard, because they don't want to show weakness. JD Vance is not going to come out and say the Iranians would not give up their control of the Strait of Hormuz. They would not agree to let these ships through because it makes it look like the Trump administration is almost imploring them to do so. So what he does is he frames this as not only is the nuclear issue the key issue, listen to his terms. He frames it as an ultimatum. Our red lines, they did not meet our demands. And there's the problem, Gerhard, if I could bring this all the way back to what happened before these talks started. When Donald Trump agreed to go into talks, he did not do so on the basis of the 15-point American ultimatum that was circulating. He did so on the basis of Iran's 10 points, which not only said we will retain a civilian nuclear program, but it said nothing about ballistic missiles or Iran's ties with groups across the Middle East. That gave the Iranians the diplomatic initiative going into these talks, and the White House has been scrambling to recover its position in the days before the talks and even yesterday.
Now, the US, the 15-point proposal reportedly included a restriction on the nuclear program. Does this imply a return to a JCPOA-style framework, meaning the nuclear deal that was once in force before Trump left it in its first term?
No, absolutely not for the Trump people, because first of all, what they're saying in their public rhetoric is a permanent end to Iran's civilian nuclear program, let alone any military program. They can't go back to the 2015 agreement, even though I think it's the most effective you have had regarding the nuclear program, because Donald Trump shredded it, stomped all over it, insulted it. When he withdrew from that agreement in 2018, that's when the Iranians went back not only to 20% enrichment of uranium, but then went to the 60%. If he goes back to JCPOA in 2015, indeed, not just he, but his advisors, they lose face. That's the fundamental problem we've got putting this back into the bottle.
Okay, let's have a look at another very important point in these negotiations. That's the Strait of Hormuz. We can have a live view at shipping traffic right now. I believe, yes, we can still see here all the tankers here on the in the lower bits. All the red dots are all tankers waiting to cross the straits. I believe the ships that we're seeing here are ships with a link to Iran or Pakistan. There's not much going on still. Now, Trump stated that he will be clearing out the strait regardless of a deal. Is the U.S. military move in the strait? He said there's 2 destroyers actually went through this strait, 2 U.S. destroyers. Is that driven more by domestic fuel prices than by military strategy?
First of all, never take Donald Trump's statement as what the reality is in terms of what's happening here. In terms of the reality of where we are is that Trump blustered yesterday about taking control of the strait, getting rid of the mines, and then in his latest tweet has threatened a naval blockade. As you mentioned, you only have 2 U.S. warships that were moving yesterday. Now, 2 warships are not going to be enough to establish control of the strait. Plus, there's a further complication which came out through U.S. officials who let it be known to the media that when the Iranians placed mines in the straits, they did so in a fairly haphazard fashion. So the Iranians are not in a position to get those mines back up. And indeed, we don't know where some of those mines are because they will have drifted in the strait. So what you have is an uncontrolled situation in the strait right now, and you have to get the diplomatic agreement so that then you can start to put the arrangements in place. In terms of the effect domestically on the U.S., you just nailed it, that as long as you have that uncertainty in the strait, you're going to have American domestic opinion being unsettled by the economic shock. And that, I think, actually will be the ultimate curb on the Trump camp that forces them to compromise.
Now, does this also the intention to clear the Strait of Hormuz from the American side, does it undermine negotiations?
It undermines negotiations if you go onto what effectively is a wartime footing, where you, for example, have American warships that fire on, for example, Iranian small boats of the Revolutionary Guards. I think even the Americans trying to lift mines in the strait is going to meet Iranian resistance. And of course, if you escalate the confrontation there, then, yeah, obviously it's going to complicate the idea to, as you know, the phrase of de-escalation. I think what we have to watch beyond this question of, getting control of the strait is, are the Americans going to really cross the Rubicon, as it were, and go for operations to go after islands? Now, everyone has focused on Kharg Island in the northern Persian Gulf, which handles 90% of Iran's oil. There's actually islands that are near the Strait of Hormuz. There are 3 islands that are disputed between Iran and the UAE, Abu Musa, Greater Tomb, and Lesser Tomb. The UAE has been pushing the Americans to seize those islands. Do the Americans say negotiations have broken down? We take matters in our own hands and step this up by going into those islands.
Now, if the mine clearing goes ahead, but if these ships draw fire from Iran, does the US have a contingency ceasefire, or does the war resume instantly?
Well, there's always a question when you have a skirmish like that in terms of, how far it spreads. I mean, so for example, if you have like one exchange of fire, then everybody might step back, right? But if it is persistent, that takes place, yeah, it adds another front to the war that takes place. The reason why I'm not sure that the Americans will go that route in terms at this point of trying to clear the mines or trying to certainly take any action against the Iranian coast, including those small boats, is what the effect has been on energy markets so far because of escalation and uncertainty. And if you get any type of military action in the Strait of Hormuz, that's going to make the situation even worse with oil and gas prices.
If you look at the catalogue of demands of the US, where do you see any leeway for them to sort of walk back to offer a compromise?
I think what we're actually looking at is probably going to be what we call confidence building measures. I think everybody looking for the grand deal, this isn't usually the way that it plays out. And just remember that back before we got the 2015 nuclear agreement, it took 21 months to get there. What might a confidence building measure look like? Iran agrees to let more ships through the Strait of Hormuz. In return, the Americans agree to unfreeze some Iranian assets, these billions of dollars that are held internationally that Iran can't get a hold to. Let's consider what another option might be. There might be an option in which both sides say, we're going to move these talks to the level of technical experts. When you do that, you move this off the political demands that are occurring. And say, for example, on the nuclear program, what you can do is the experts can go with not an all or nothing. Either Iran continues at its current level of enrichment or has no enrichment whatsoever. But you can kind of get back to that level of, okay, here's a suitable limit on their enrichment program. Here are the measures for inspections by the IAEA. Here's what we can do in terms of enrichment to be shipped out of the country. Now, again, I said earlier, that would actually take us back towards where we were in the 2015 agreement. So politically, you've got to be careful there. But it does sort of give you, if the experts are talking about it, we're not at the point of confrontation.
Now, you talked about the experts, but let's talk about the delegation. JD Vance, he had mentioned that he was consulting with Trump, Secretary Rubio and Admiral Cooper a dozen times, at least, during this marathon 21-hour session. Does this level of micromanagement from Washington suggest a lack of trust in Vance?
No, I don't think so. And I'm going to take this on two levels to go back to that issue of experts, by the way. The first is that I think it's interesting that for 6 weeks, JD Vance not only stood away from this war, he, through his people, let it be known to the press that he didn't favor the war. Now, that puts him in a different position than Donald Trump, of course, who always blusters about getting rid of Iranian civilization. And I think Vance was genuinely looking for an off-ramp here. And I say that not just because of the question of trying to lower the temperature in the Gulf. Vance's priority is not the Middle East or Iran. Vance's priority is Europe, where he was earlier this week trying to get Viktor Orban reelected in Hungary in the elections that take place today. Because Vance and his advisors, they're behind the U.S. national security strategy that came out in December that said the priority here for us is to undermine the European Union and to get hard right governments in power. Now, Vance would like to get back to that, but he needs to get this issue of Iran off the table. But that raises a further problem here. I don't think Trump is reliable. I think Trump is white noise. I think Marco Rubio at this point is politically paralyzed. I think the question here is, where are those experts that you need to get a detailed settlement? Mm-hmm. If you looked yesterday and you saw it when you showed the footage of Vance, who is that behind him? That's a real estate developer, Steve Witkoff. That's Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Where are the economic experts? Where are the experts on the nuclear program? And that hasn't just been a problem of yesterday's talks. That's been a problem in all the talks between U.S. and Iran this year, going back to 2025, is that the Americans keep putting in people who don't have specific expertise on Iran, on the region, or on the nuclear issue, because a lot of those officials have been pushed out of the Trump administration, and that's going to be a problem going forward.
Scott, before I let you go, consult your crystal ball. Where do you see the next round of talks going, if they indeed happen?
Well, I mean, I'm going to preempt it in a way and say, look, my crystal ball is even murky in terms of whether we get that next round of talks. And I'm going to tell you, if we do not get that next round of talks, then we've got serious issues. Remember that the temporary ceasefire expires a week on Tuesday. If we do get the talks, I think, again, I'm going to ask the same question I did yesterday. Are these just simply talks about talks, or do we have a defined agenda? We need to get these points with an agreed agenda between the two sides. Where are your priorities? Strait of Hormuz, nuclear program, ballistic missiles, links with regional groups. And then I'm going to look for the position that each side puts on those agenda items. At this point, I think the best that we can hope for is that the two sides do meet again. But I don't think we can do so with an expectation that we're going to have a quick breakthrough resolving this crisis.
Scott, I get a feeling this is not the last time we'll be talking about this and these talks. Thank you very much, Scott Lucas there.
Thank you.
And we can now go, and I would like to take the opportunity to encourage our viewers to post your questions into the chat down here. Dr. Kamran Matin is next. He's an Associate Professor of International Relations, University of Sussex in the UK, and an expert on the Middle East and Iran in particular. Now, the Iranian delegation, led by Speaker Ghalibaf, entered these talks with, quote, deep distrust. Given the failure to reach a deal today, does Tehran view that the summit as a genuine diplomatic effort by the US that it has failed, if it was a genuine diplomatic effort by the US?
Hi, Gerhard, and thanks for the invitation. Well, I mean, according to what we hear from Iranian officials and members of delegation, they do not believe that US was serious about these talks, that it did not display the flexibility that actually JD Vance was claiming in the press conference. And obviously you would expect, finger pointing from both sides. So on the Iranian side, they might claim that the composition of the delegation and the level at which the members kind of stood in Iranian political structure was a signal, an indication that they were serious. They were able to make decisions on the spot without having to consult Tehran, unlike JD Vance, who claimed to have talked to Trump dozens of times. And Iranians might actually, invoke that as a sign that Vance had not arrived with full authority to make a deal. But I think these are really the details. The fundamental issue remains, as previous guest also kind of implied, the fundamental differences are over Iran's nuclear project and its missile and drone capability and the proxy forces and so on. In the press conference, though, it must be said, Vance only singled out the nuclear program, and the affirmative commitment, which you also cited from him, interestingly had two parts. One was about Iran not pursuing nuclear weapon, which Iran has always maintained it does not. So that is really not a concession from Iranian side, because they have been consistent about that line, even if the other side may not trust them. But the second part of Vance's affirmative commitment was that Iran should give up the means by which it can pursue a nuclear weapon, which effectively means enrichment installations as well as the highly enriched uranium. So this is the things which Iran highly unlikely to ever compromise on.
You mentioned the composition of the two delegations there. We're going to come back to that in a moment. But first, I would like to ask you the same thing that I asked Scott earlier. Who needs to deal more, in your view, right now, Iran or the US?
I mean, the suffering and damages which Iran has sustained are enormous. But I think Iranian calculation is that they are able to, sustain the pain of the war for longer than the Americans and as well as Europeans, basically the whole world, because of the way in which they have completely, impacted global economy because of the closure of Strait of Hormuz, not to mention the destruction, or at least partial destruction, of Gulf states' gas and oil exportation infrastructure and so on. I mean, for a country which can easily, for a state can easily kill thousands of protesters in 48 hours, as it happened back in January, the human and probably economic destruction inside the country is not something which would change their calculus, so long as, and that's the important point, so long as they can fire missiles and drones at Israel and Gulf states, because especially Gulf states are extremely vulnerable to such attacks, and that in turn impacts global economy, which in turn has political implications for someone like Trump.
Now, I would like to bring up a tweet by the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman, Esmaeil Baqaei, and he tweeted the following. Maybe we can bring that up. Yes, we can. We even have it nicely prepared. The heavy loss of our great elders, dear ones, and fellow countrymen has made our resolve to pursue the Iranian nation's interests and rights firmer than ever before. And that's an interesting point, coming back to what you've said, the demand that Iran give not only up its facilities to enrich uranium, but also presumably the stockpiles of already enriched uranium that it has. Does this not indicate, this tweet that we just heard, that Iran will pursue a nuclear weapon more vigorously than ever now?
It's quite possible now, without the restrictions which theologically was justified by late Ayatollah Khamenei. And, in the Shia Islam, a supreme leader, or rather a source of emulation, as the Shia Islam stipulates, can issue different edicts. So one source of formulation, which is, who's currently supreme leader, can override what's been said before. So the religious ban on nuclear weapon and the development of them, which was, repeatedly stated by Ayatollah Khamenei and was presented by Iranians to the Americans as the basis on which they should trust them that they are not developing a nuclear weapon, is no longer there. And we don't know exactly what Mujtaba Khamenei, the son of the Ali Khamenei, is standing with respect to the nuclear weapon, as well as after the war began several weeks ago, Iranian parliament, considered Iran leaving NPT so that Iran has a legal basis for pursuit of potentially a nuclear weapon. So I think this tweet might suggest that not only Iran is not giving up on enrichment ability, but it might also consider actually going towards weaponization as the ultimate deterrence, preventing a repetition of attacks on it.
I'd like to come to a few user comments here. One TikTok user, SNSY, writes, the US has attacked Iran in the middle of talks in February. Why would the Iranians believe the US again? And Linda Smith watches us on YouTube, and she says maybe the US should send real diplomats. And that's sort of echoing the critique that we've heard from Scott earlier. But I'd like to come back to what you've hinted upon earlier, the composition of the Iranian delegation there. Ghalibaf, the leader of the Iranian delegation, is a former IRGC, that's the Republican Guard commander. His presence as lead negotiator, doesn't that suggest that the military wing of the Iranian government is now fully in charge of diplomacy, sidelining maybe the foreign ministry?
I think we already knew that IRGC has basically taken over after the war started, and the very election or selection of Mujtaba Khamenei, the son of Ali Khamenei, as the supreme leader was seen by many Iran observers as a sign that IRGC is influencing that process, because Mujtaba Khamenei was their favorite candidate, who actually does not have the theological credentials to have that post. But Ghalibaf's, I think, presence and leading the leading the delegation has actually more importance in the sense that he has very close ties to the new supreme leader. He has obviously close ties to IRGC as a former commander, and he's also basically running a massive economic, cooperation, or informal one within Iran, involved in massive construction projects, of which there were actually multiple reports in recent years of corruption, and he was criticized by other factions for embezzlement and misuse of government funds and so on. So he has actually a portfolio which probably makes him perfect in terms of making a deal with Americans, because he's also able to both envision but also offer the kind of economic incentives to the American side in terms of American involvement in Iranian economy, as well as construction section and so on, which might be attractive to someone like Trump, who's always after some sort of economic incentives. The problem remains the nuclear issue, which for Trump is extremely difficult to return to a JCPOA kind of formulation, because, as also Scott mentioned, that would show extreme weakness, and also shows that he, after 15 years or so, he has reached the same thing which Obama had already accomplished, and that's also embarrassment. So I think Trump has dug in that position, and Iran is unable to accept giving up the nuclear project unless there is a new formulation, which was actually on the agenda in the last round of the talks, about a consortium in which Iran and US and other countries are involved. Whether this becomes an issue again in the future potential talks, we don't know. But that might be a formulation that satisfies both sides to some extent.
Now, another user comment here on the US side of the delegation. Lucid Comment writes, I do have my doubts that Vance was good in that situation, but I'd like to come back to the Iranian side, and especially because you mentioned Mujtaba Khamenei. The supreme leader is reportedly badly injured in hospital or reconvalescing somewhere. Is he, or to which degree is he personally involved in these talks? Do we know that? Or are just other factions there pulling the strings now?
Well, I have also seen only the reports you're referring to, as well as what Iranian media sort of publish, according to which he is in touch with other, members of the Iranian leadership via voice messages as well as texts and so on, because they also are very worried about his security and his potential, being targeted by Israel or America. So he seems to be, conscious enough to have a say on what's going on. And it was said that Ghalibaf and the delegation which arrived in Islamabad had full authority from Khamenei, who also issued actually a tweet before the delegation departed, just to indicate that he's on the same page with the team he's sending. So this is what we know. But in reality, whether these are just propaganda and IRGC actually is making the ultimate decisions, something difficult to really verify at this point.
Now, we have a comment here from TikTok. User Ilian suggests, I think both sides want a deal to have a ceasefire, but Israel doesn't want to. There was no Israeli delegation at the talks. Where does Israel fit into these discussions? And I'd like to add that recent Iranian state TV editorial suggests that the IRGC views a ceasefire without an Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon as a strategic surrender. How much does the situation in Lebanon dictate Iran's willingness to sign any deal?
I think it has huge importance, in fact. Iran's regional as well as deterrence strategy for decades has been based on basically on three things: the threshold nuclear status, the missile project, as well as so-called proxy forces, of which Hezbollah is the most important and arguably most powerful one, and most strategically important one because it's right next to Israel. So not only Iran needs Hezbollah to remain intact strategically, but also this time in particular is very difficult for Iran not to take Hezbollah's interest in these negotiations, because Hezbollah entered into the war in support of Iran, even though at the point that the war was launched by Israel and US, Hezbollah was in a ceasefire with Israel. So if basically IRGC throw them under the bus at this point, I think Iran's or Islamic Republic's credibility with other proxy forces will be highly questioned. And therefore, I think they will pursue this line about the potential peace or ceasefire has to be expanded and extended to the whole region, including in particular Lebanon.
Finally, Dr. Matin, before I let you go, assuming the talks continue, as was indicated, maybe as early as tomorrow, in your view, what are the chances for these talks to succeed and end the war?
I'm not very optimistic, to be honest. I think without Trump's reformulation of the demands regarding Iran's enrichment, abilities, nuclear enrichment, it's very unlikely that Iran would budge on that, given how the identity of the Islamic Republic and its scientific legitimacy over recent decades, and also the enormity of the cost which this project has imposed on Iranian people over decades, is tied to this one element of their wider strategy. But there is a possibility that US will take a back seat, if you like, retains those conditions, but does not engage in ongoing bombing of Iran, letting Israel and potentially UAE, which has been extremely unhappy with even with the ceasefire and the potential terms of a peace agreement to continue the attacks. But that wouldn't obviously solve the problem of Strait of Hormuz or Iran's attacks on the Gulf states. So it's quite difficult to see how this is going to unfold. But it's not impossible that U.S. might give it another try, if you like to put it that way, to see that if some more attacking on Iran's infrastructure might change Iranian position. But I doubt that will really have an impact.
Dr. Matin, I have one final comment from a TikTok user here called Alan Dave, and he just simply says, Trump has made Iran stronger. In a nutshell, do you believe that that's true?
In the short term, I think that's true, because if you look at the Strait of Hormuz, this was not an issue before the war began. Iran had not closed it before. It had not impacted global economy. Now, actually, one of the sticking points of this negotiations is the reopening of a strait which was already open before the war. So, and Iran obviously has discovered the enormous impact of this one geographical weapon it wields. So in that sense, it is stronger. But I would imagine that the challenge facing the Islamic Republic of Iran is not so much not surviving the war, but surviving the peace, because it depends on how the peace eventually is achieved. Iran has lost massive amount of its infrastructure, the economy, the people who worked in those factories and companies which have been destroyed, the roads. If the sanctions remain in place, how are they going to satisfy a population of 90 million with an economy which is several times weaker than before the war started? So I think those are really domestic challenges which Islamic Republic might find more difficult to deal with rather than the war itself, because they have all these missiles on the ground and they can just fire, almost forever, given the number of missiles they claim to have, and that is in itself enough to to cause a lot of pain on global political economy. But what matters is in what terms, under what circumstances the war actually stops, and which is why I think Iran is insisting on this releasing of the frozen funds, their lifting of all sanctions, because they know in the end of the day the economic challenges they are facing and they have been facing are the key issues for them.
A few very interesting closing thoughts there. Iran needing to survive the war and then survive the peace. Thank you very much, Dr. Kamran Matin, there, for sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you very much.
And that's it from me and the YouTube team here for today. Thanks so much for all of you for joining us, especially those of you who contributed to the conversation with a few of their own thoughts and questions. Very much appreciate that, though I don't have to do all the work. Now, we will continue to follow events in the Middle East for you, of course, and try to make sense of it all. But for now, it's thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.